Kim Jong-nam was poisoned. There is widespread speculation that North Korea is behind the murder.
If he wanted to carry out this assassination, in transit was, I guess, what they figured out. Perhaps this was his best choice. We will never know this.
It's a country where they send people to gulags, and that fear was there all the time.
Turkey is the biggest jail for journalists in the world.
Are you journalists? I think I'm getting... Passport, please.
I was put on a list and I was banned from the country.
I'm Diana Swain. We are The Investigators. This is what we do. How does a reporter cover a story in a country they're not in? And what's it like when a country bites back at reporting it doesn't like?
This CCTV footage we're about to show may cause some distress to some of you.
Kim Jong-un's estranged half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, allegedly murdered, targeted by female assassins, reportedly the victim of a spy movie-style hit.
An extraordinary killing being linked back to a blood feud between the brothers of North Korea's ruling family. But this story didn't play out inside the secretive country. It happened in full view at Malaysia's largest airport.
He's approached by this woman at the airport, and as you can see, a second woman there is lunging from behind. She has a cloth and holds it over his face.
The brazen attack on the North Korean leader's half-brother, who had long feared Kim Jong-un was trying to have him killed, has now been broadcast around the world.
After the scuffle, Kim Jong-nam is seen complaining to airport personnel and seeking help. Kim died on the way to the hospital.
Malaysian authorities say Kim was poisoned with VX nerve agent and have charged 2 women with his murder. But what are North Koreans being told?
So why now? Well,
the CBC's Sasha Petrusik has been covering this story from our bureau in Beijing.
But with the murky world of North Korean power politics, we may never know.
Getting into North Korea is difficult. It can take months. So how do journalists gather information from a country that remains among the most secretive in the world?
So Sasha, let's begin there. How do you cover this story when you can't get into North Korea?
Well, you're absolutely right, Diana. I mean, North Korea is possibly the most difficult place on earth to get information out of. The curtain is very tightly drawn at all times.
How do you manage that?
Well, I think you pick up bits of information everywhere you possibly can. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Seoul in South Korea. There's a great deal of information that's floating around there from the intelligence services, also from people who have escaped from North Korea and made their home now in South Korea. They have been talking, they've written books, they've talked to journalists there. They are fairly open about what they've experienced. And also, there's others who are in North Korea. Not many foreigners are in North Korea. Very few journalists are there also, but there are diplomats. There are others who travel in there every once in a while, and so you have to piece together these bits and pieces of information and try to come up with a broader narrative.
And what do we know about what North Koreans have heard, if anything?
Well, it's an interesting case because in this particular situation, the North Korean government has actually been holding scrums. They've been holding news conferences, but not inside the country, not in North Korea. They've actually been releasing bits and pieces of information which have been broadcast outside North Korea. And the ambassador to Malaysia, for instance, held a scrum on the front steps of the embassy there. As far as we know, that was not broadcast inside North Korea. The average North Korean probably knows very little, if anything, about this whole case, even though it concerns the ruling family, and perhaps that's why they don't know very much about it.
So let's assume for a moment that Kim Jong-un did orchestrate and order this attack. Why would a man who is so secretive bring this kind of scrutiny upon himself?
Well, he had very little choice if, in fact, he wanted to do this because his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, doesn't live in North Korea, hasn't been there in years. In fact, he makes his home in Macau, which is the gambling enclave here in China. He's been sort of under the protection of the Chinese government unofficially ever since he left the country many years ago. And so, first of all, I think it would have been difficult for Kim Jong-un to carry out this assassination inside China. It would have offended the Chinese. They would have been very, very upset. And when you think about it, the Chinese are really one of the only friends that North Korea has internationally. So really it had to be somewhere else. And in transit was, I guess, what they figured out.
Very interesting. Thanks, Sasha.
My pleasure, Dinah.
Foreign journalists are rarely allowed into North Korea. The CBC's Nala Ayed was one of the few granted access last year.
Well, let's go, guys. Yep.
When they are let in, reporters are often directed to observe carefully choreographed events. In this case, the first Congress in decades of North Korea's ruling party.
Government guides led dozens of foreign journalists to the venue where the Congress was being held. But this is as close as we got.
Only a handful of foreign news outlets, including the Associated Press and Agence France-Presse, have been given permission to open bureaus in the capital, Pyongyang. But their movements inside the so-called Hermit Kingdom are tightly controlled, leading some to find other ways to get at the stories inside.
So I pose as a teacher and a missionary.
Investigative journalist and author Suki Kim got a job at a school for children of the elite in Pyongyang, secretly chronicling what she observed and risking her freedom to do it.
So, Suki, let's begin there. Why did you do it?
There was just no other way to tell the truth from inside North Korea. I had covered it for about a decade before finally going in there undercover. And this was, so carefully orchestrated theater. And, if I were to jot that down, I felt like I would just be a publicist for the regime. So I looked for another way, and undercover was the only way.
And what did you see undercover that you hadn't previously been exposed to?
It took a long time, but, all the superficial information about North Korea, we do have some knowledge from defectors. What I was after was the psychology, and that is sort of in getting to know people on an individual basis, never from any interview format, but by getting to know them. And through that, little, very, very, very tiny details, when you combine them, you begin to realize what kind of control they live under. And the people I was with were the elite. We never hear that about elite being under absolute control.
So give me an example of something that you witnessed or observed that surprised you.
That if you were to ask them about the internet, these were the university students whose majors were computer, they would all tell you they know everything about it. Everybody's on the internet. It takes a while when you realize from their questions, when they ask you things like, what are the numbers of movies are you allowed to watch on the internet? Are you able to, if you don't even know that basic fact, that there's an infinity to the concept of internet, it was very clear after a while they didn't know what that was.
How did you keep and hide your notes? How did you keep track of what you were observing in order to write it later without being found out?
I came out of there with about 400-page notes. And because my cover was teacher, I could have a laptop with me, which I carried with me at all times. The final time was my 5th time in North Korea. So I knew what I was in for, meaning they would go through all my things and minders were with me all the time. So I wrote morning and night and kept all the documents on USB sticks and erased everything from computer every single time. I kept an SD card where I had a backup copy, which I also hid in the room with the light off. So it took, just endless surveillance that was surrounding me and for me to be careful. And because I knew if those were found, then it would be breaking their national security, and the punishment for that is unfathomable.
Well, and let's, get to that. What would have happened to you if they'd realized what you were really doing?
Well, reporting inside North Korea, to actually write a book in there has never been done because it's that scary. It's a country where they send people to gulags for, carrying a Bible and passing it out. So I don't think that what I had done would have let me live, really. I mean, that's my guess, and that fear was there all the time, every second.
Well, it was remarkably brave of you to do it. Thanks for talking about it.
Thank you.
North Korea may present a unique challenge for reporters, but even in other countries, journalists can be kicked out for their coverage.
Like, I was kicked out of the country. I couldn't go back.
Photojournalist Ed O on why he was barred from Turkey and how that's affected his work around the world. And next, sexual misconduct allegations tarnish a major jewelry retailer. One of 5 things we learned from investigative journalism this week. But first, President Trump's big speech to Congress.
The President of the United States.
The pomp, the promises.
We will raise wages, help the unemployed, save billions and billions of dollars.
And of course, the pundits' reviews, even praise from his harshest critics.
He became President of the United States in that moment, period.
The Vice President and the Speaker of the House looked pleased. Even so-called Lion Ted and Little Marco applauded. Of course, not everyone was impressed. Still, this was a different Trump.
But we can only get there together.
Could that have anything to do with this? He stuck to his teleprompter, even though his feelings about them are well known.
Hillary with the teleprompters every single time. You know what? I like it better without the teleprompter.
Take it from me, Mr. President. It's not the technology you have to worry about. It's the script.
Damn it! Who typed a question mark on the teleprompter?
I'm Ron Burgundy.
Damn it!
Here are 5 things we learned this week from investigative journalists. Variety magazine got to the bottom of the biggest blunder in Oscar history. It printed photos appearing to show a distracted accountant mixing up envelopes backstage before the wrong Best Picture was announced. The Washington Post revealed hundreds of employees of Sterling Jewelers, the company that owns Kay Jeweler stores, say they faced sexual harassment and discrimination at work. The company denies the allegations. CBC Marketplace released DNA test results that show some chicken sandwiches sold by the Subway restaurant chain contain a large portion of filler ingredients. Subway disputes those findings. The Washington Post was first to report U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions met with the Russian ambassador twice last year while Sessions was advising Donald Trump's presidential election campaign. Sessions had testified under oath no such contact occurred. And CBC News obtained secret documents detailing Canada's plans for responding to a September 11th style attack, including precise information about how officials would determine when to shoot down a hijacked plane. Portions of the documents were marked for redaction, but the sensitive information was still visible.
Earlier, we showed you how hard it is for journalists to get into North Korea and cover that secretive country. But sometimes reporters can get into trouble covering countries where attitudes towards journalists change overnight.
A reporter working for a German newspaper is behind bars this week in Turkey, charged with publishing terrorist propaganda. In fact, he's just the latest journalist there to be jailed for his job. Dozens of journalists have been detained since last July, when a faction of Turkey's military tried to overthrow the country's elected government. The coup was crushed and was followed by a massive government crackdown.
Excuse me.
Come here. Are you journalist?
We're, I think I'm getting...
Passport, please. Just a minute.
I think we're, I'm being...
Just a minute.
Okay.
May I see your passport,
So,
please?
Errol,
Which included the shuttering of more than 100 news outlets.
And Turkey is the biggest jail for journalists in the world.
Journalists had been complaining about rising intimidation before the coup. Turkey's president justifies it this way.
Engaging in actions which are not allowed by law should have certain prices to pay.
Ed O is a Canadian photojournalist who lived in Turkey until he suddenly found himself among those barred because of their reporting.
So, Ed, let's go back to when you were living there, why you were there, and the work that you were doing.
So I first moved to Turkey in 2012, and by that time the Arab Spring had taken hold in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and all these places in the Middle East. And it became very insecure to live in Cairo, where I was based before. There was a lot of restrictions on movement. And so a lot of journalists, myself included, moved to Istanbul as kind of like a haven, as a base away from covering the a lot of like the news in the Middle East, in the Arab world. And so when I first got to Turkey, it was actually at that time quite, I don't want to say friendly for journalists, but it was, they were very benign to journalists. And as the story in Syria began to escalate, Istanbul was really a jump-off point to covering activists and the story from Syria because it was so difficult to work in that country.
And so then you found, as your work does, it takes you all over the world. You left to cover a story, and then when you attempted to get back to Turkey, tell me what happened.
Well, so I first tried to renew my visa to go back. I was abroad and I was trying to go back in, and then they said that my visa had become canceled at the airport, and I was thinking like, well, this is very strange. So I went to the Turkish embassy and they said that I was put on a list and I was banned from the country. And when I asked who put me on this list, they said it was the police, and I asked them for more clarification. They said they simply just can't tell me. And I told them like, I'm a journalist, I work in Turkey, I'm based there, what's the issue? And then all they said was that we can't tell you any more than we've told you, you have to leave. And basically that's it. Like, I was kicked out of the country, I couldn't go back.
What kind of implications does that have for journalists when a country that they've been covering and in fact living in changes so profoundly as Turkey has?
Well, I've been a journalist for almost a decade now, and this is really not new to me. I've worked in places like Somalia, where my coverage has also made me unable to go back. Places like Yemen, Bahrain, it's the same thing. And so, unfortunately for me, this is a very common occurrence, getting kicked out of countries or unable to return to places that I used to be based. And this represents kind of, I would say, like a wider crackdown on press freedoms all around the world. And so the implications of this is that once you end up on a list somewhere, once you become flagged, this really follows you everywhere you go, the fact that you've been not allowed to go back into a country. And Turkey specifically has a very large foreign policy footprint in the Middle East, and so that does have wider implications for my ability to work in other parts of the region and potentially globally.
And I know that that's part of the reason you feel so strongly about why Canadian journalists need to protect the freedoms that they have here.
Yeah, and really, like, the freedom of the press and our privacy is a global issue. And so we as Canadians in the West or wherever we are, really have to stand up for our individual rights in our own countries, because what happens in Canada, what happens in the States, and what happens in the West really reflects on press freedoms all around the world. So if the Canadian government spies on journalists or they search journalists' phones at the borders, that gives almost carte blanche a reason for actually authoritarian countries to do the same thing. And so an erosion of press freedoms everywhere you go is something that will affect every journalist around the world, especially in places that don't enjoy as much press freedom as we have in Canada or, let's say, the States.
Well, you've certainly had some varied experiences. Thanks for sharing them.
Thank you.
No other candidate in this race will do this.
The medium is the message. Just ahead, my thoughts on a political video that went viral this week, plus social media and investigative journalism.
Do you feel rushed investigating a story now?
Ask Me Anything is next. First, investigators on assignment.
I'm Jody Porter, a senior reporter in northwestern Ontario. Delaine Copenese was within steps of her house in Kenora, Ontario when she disappeared last winter. Hundreds of people in the small community came together to search for the First Nations teenager. Nearly a month went by before her body was found in Lake of the Woods, just blocks from her home. We traveled to Kenora to look into the many questions surrounding Delaine's death and disappearance. We found a community long divided by race coming together in its love for a lost little girl. We'll have Delaine's story in the days ahead on CBC Television, radio, and online.
Every week we invite you to ask me a question about investigative journalism, and this week Lange has a question for me, so fire away.
Do you feel rushed investigating a story now when social media expects and provides new information so fast and all the time?
It's a good question, and I have two parts to my answer. So I would say, no, I don't feel rushed at what I would call the kind of front end of the work, because the one thing about investigative journalism is that you're largely keeping secret what you're working on. So no one else, even our competitors, is aware of what you're looking at. So you're not looking over your shoulder in the same way. But once the story is out there and you're aware that everyone's looking at it now, that's when you have one eye on your phone and on social media all day long, trying to make sure that you're not now getting scooped on your own story. But you still have the same tests to meet in terms of when you deliver new information. Is it fair? Are you sure it's true? And are you telling it in a way that makes sense to people as opposed to just rushing it out because it's the next thing you've learned, but people don't understand the context? So I'd say at the front end of the work, the social media thing, the kind of the 24-hour pulse hasn't affected us. But once the story's out, yeah, it'd be wrong to say you're not aware of what's going on online. Does that answer the question?
Thank you, Diana. Yes.
Good. Thanks for asking it.
The federal government has a duty to act and help Canadians weather this storm.
Remember that video? Back in 2008, Stéphane Dion's team sent it to all the networks when he was Liberal leader. The production values were so bad, his team was forced to publicly apologize. But so far, no one is taking the fall for a video released this week by Conservative leadership candidate Kelly Leitch.
Canada is an opportunity. An opportunity to work hard and provide for oneself and one's family.
It's about 8 minutes long and posted to her Facebook page. And while early assumptions were that the video, full of strange camera moves and awkward pauses, was posted before it was finished, it appears it's supposed to look that way.
Go direct to the source. I encourage you, go and look at my video. Well, what I would encourage people to do is to go straight to my website.
Now, some people have mused that this was all strategy. Do something so off the wall that people have to start talking about you. And in a field of more than a dozen candidates, you have to do something to stand out. But one assumes that Leitch wanted people to listen to what she was saying. And in this case, the medium really was the message. It's doubtful anyone heard a word. I'm Diana Swain. We are The Investigators.